I think we can start
Shall
now.
we start?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Saneya, over to you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all those present with us. Today, we have amongst us Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, who is going to give the keynote address on lingual estrangement. Can we call a language our own? We also have with us Professor Hans Harder and Professor Nishat Zaidi. Although they don't need any introduction, I shall still say a few lines. Professor Hans Harder is a professor of modern South Asian languages and literature at the South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University, Germany. His research interests are modern literatures in South Asia, particularly Bengali, religious movements, and intellectual history. He is the author of Sufism and Saint Veneration in Bangladesh. He has also co-edited Asian Punches, a transcultural affair, and literary sentiments in the vernacular. I welcome you, sir. Professor Nishat Zaidi is a professor in Head Department of English, Jamia, Millia, Islamia. Her research interests include post-colonial writing, Indian literature in English translation, comparative literature and women's writing. A scholar, critic, and translator, and my teacher, she has 10 books and a number of published papers to her credit. She has co-edited Story is a Vagabond, fiction, essays, and drama by Intizar Hussain. She has also guest edited 2 special issues of the review journal, The Book Review. Her translation of Day and Dastan is her most recent publication. Thank you for being with us here. I now invite Professor Hans Harder to give an introduction to our keynote speaker, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you so much for this kind introduction. And now it's my turn to introduce our chief guest tonight, or this morning, whichever way you take it, right? So I'm proud and happy to introduce Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, who is a specialist in intellectual history and Indian politics. He has a PhD from JNU, then moved on to SOAS, to the School of Oriental and African Studies, and afterwards to Columbia University, where he teaches now. He has a focus in his research on colonial and post-colonial intellectual history of South Asia. That always means South Asia within a global context, within a colonial and also a global context. And there's plenty of seminal publications that he has to his credit in his field. Often these are publications with particular reference to literature, to language, and in one word, to the issues we are discussing here during our conference. I may just name drop 3 of his publications, 3 of his books that I think are particularly interesting and relevant also for us. The first one would be The Unhappy Consciousness, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and the Formation of Nationalist Discourse, his, I think, first major book, which came out in 1995. Another one I have to mention is The Imaginary Institution of India, a must-read for students of intellectual history and sociology. That came out in 2010. And again, one more, The Invention of Private Life from 2015. And I could go on for a long time, but I won't do that because we want to hear him speak. Let me just say that he writes in both English and Bengali. And the interposition between these 2 languages, I would say between his 2 first languages, this interposition is what he will address now as he delivers his keynote address on lingual estrangement. Can we call a language our own? So I'm greatly looking forward, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, perfectly well.
Okay. I'm very grateful to you for this invitation to talk about something which is very close to my heart, but I don't think I get to discuss it very often, often enough. And I must say that I do not see the question of language being discussed deeply and seriously enough in the academia, um, neither in my field of political science, political theory, or social theory, nor always very much in discussions among people who study literature. So that's why I'm very happy that you are organizing a conference on this scale to think about this, because I think the basic issues of what I would call lingual estrangement uh, are issues which can only be studied through collaboration between two types of scholars, scholars who study language uh, and social scientists, that is, language scholars who study language itself, and social scientists who study language in the social world. So I'm basically a social theory person, so I would take it from that angle. Estrangement is a very interesting concept. I want to use the term estrangement because it not really points to us the existence of things which are strange in the world. What attracts me to this language is to this concept is the idea in Marx that what should be strange and what should not be strange have exchanged places in the world, uh, which is not the kind of world in which we normally expect to live. And I think the world which is left behind by colonialism is intrinsically a world of this kind. And one of the fields in which I think this is most profound, and it is most profound because we do not subject it to analysis, because you cannot change something if you do not see that that exists. I think is the question of language. So that's why it's so important. I do not have much time. So what I shall do is, and I also apologize to you for not giving you a well thought out and argued paper. I hope when you publish the book, if I write the paper, I'll write something which is more uh, solidly worked out. But I wanted to mention 3 or 4 points quickly. I think that when we try to understand language, I felt when I was long time back when I was in SOAS, especially talking to 2 of my students who were doing their PhD work with me, Francesca Orsini and Veena Narigal, who I think is part of your conference. I felt very strongly that uh, when we try to understand language, we should not focus on language because that immediately focuses our attention in a way where we think of a particular language, English or Bengali or, uh, or whatever. Actually, we should think of what I called in a paper I wrote long time back called Writing, Speaking, Being. We should try, we should make the object of our analysis the linguistic economy. That is the structure of life in which we live, where languages play parts. And it's usually not a single language which constitutes that linguistic world. It's a combination of many different languages which constitute that world. But the second point that I made in that paper, which I want to develop more through the opportunity your conference has given me, is that it's tritely true to say that there are different languages which play their part in constituting our world. Why is it trite? It's true because it's obvious. It's trite because if you do not look into what that structure is, what is the function of the different languages which play their role in my world, I don't think we can go very far with that initial insight. I'll give you an example of what I said in that paper and what I now want to do in the paper that I shall write for you. In that paper, I wanted to draw our attention to the fact that language is not just a means of communication, or a more rigorous way of putting it would be to say that, of course, it is a means of communication, but the means of communication has 2 functions. The means of communication has the first function, the most obvious function of communicating. And it has an unobvious function of in-communication. If I want somebody not to understand what I'm saying to you, I would speak it in a language which you and I understand, but the third person, the maid or a poor person who is sitting next to us cannot understand, which is equally a part of the function of language. It is language which is causing that incommunication. It's not silence which is causing that incommunication. And we do not observe that. We do not think it's our task as analysts and intellectuals to understand the darker side of the functions of language. Let me now give an example, not of a darker side, but it's dark in a slightly different sense. This brings us to the main question I wanted to discuss with you, which is my doing social science as a Bengali. As a Bengali meaning, I'm a Bengali when I'm writing in Bengali. I'm still a Bengali when I'm writing in English. But you could also ask a question that, am I a Bengali when I'm writing in English? To what extent am I a Bengali while I'm writing in English? But you would understand that when I'm writing in Bengali, suppose I'm writing an essay on estrangement in Bengali, in my Bangla, which is all Bangla words, the semantic content of the English word estrangement would have a huge influence. That's what I'm trying to explain to my Bengali audience. And it's not very easy to find a term. What we would normally do would be to find a term and then make the term do something which the term is not used to do. And so I would take a Bengali term and then I would have to shift the content of that term, the usual content of that term, in the direction where it can incorporate into the semantic charge or the semantic content of the term estrangement. But estrangement is not an English term. Estrangement is a German term in a very, very significant sense. It comes through a certain tradition of German thought, which through several stages and generations, develops the semantic force of the idea of estrangement in Marx. And so you have to be, what I'm saying is that, it actually puts us in a very complex linguistic situation. I don't think when a German scholar is writing in German, he faces the situation of this. Faces is not the right word. I do not face it. Most of the time it actually works on my mind, from the back of my mind, as it were. And the task is actually to make us face it, to bring it from the back of our mind to the front of our mind, in a certain sense, to place it in front of our eyes, and to make it a subject of analysis. Only then we can think clearly about it. So this is the first point. Let me give another example. Again, from social science. Uh, Francesca Orsini and Mina Naregal, both of them worked on topics which they call the public sphere. The public sphere exists in language. And now we have a lot of work after Habermas on the nature of the public sphere. And nowadays, everybody would accept that a flat public sphere, which is sometimes suggested if you read Habermas's original book, a flat public sphere does not exist. The public sphere is always has a topography of high and low. The public sphere is sloped. Some people can get into the public sphere easily. Some people cannot get into the public sphere easily. I think when I said in my letter to Professor Zaidi that I would like to think about how colonialism always places us in a translational situation. This is what I meant, that when I write in Bangla, I am in a translational situation in this sense. There are at least three different layers of language, English, German, etc., which are acting upon my striving to express myself in Bengali, to communicate certain ideas. And I think it also works when I write in English. I'll simply make a remark without giving an example. I tell my students that just as when I speak English, the vocalization of Bengali, which is my native language, expresses itself in the way in which I speak English, right? And I think that this is also true of the way we think or the way we write, not in our physical speaking, but in our thinking. The fact that, in a certain sense, my base language is Bengali, and I wrote in Bengali recently. I sent that to a paper in which I said that everybody goes around with a with some kind of a small library, which is not in our backpack, but which is at the back of our mind. And the library that I go around with everywhere in the world is a library which consists of Bunkim, Tagore, Rabindranath, one of my favorite comic poets, Sukumar Rai. I think he constitutes my world very deeply. Whenever I see something as funny, the language of that funniness actually comes to me from reading Sukumar Rai. And also a book which I read when I was in primary school, which was called Sahaj Path. It's an alphabet book, but I'm deeply indebted to that alphabet book because I think it actually taught me how to read the world, not just read the alphabet, but also it's a book which is full of pictures, very elementary pictures. But the pictures actually taught me very deeply to see what is beautiful in the world. So I think I carry that in my mind. So it is in that sense that when I write in English, there's a presence of Bengali language and linguistic culture in my thinking. Let me now turn to expand on the question of the incommunicative function of language in the question of translation. So colonialism places us always in a translational situation because of this kind of operation of language. But I can extend my earlier argument about the incommunicative function of language to claim that there can be two types of language translational experiences in our world. I need to develop this a bit more, but I want to if I write out this paper. Let me call that, I haven't thought about the terms yet, but let me call that through true provisional terms. One is the fluent translation, fluent communicability, because we are in control of both languages. Never fully, never absolutely, but more or less evenly. So I do not feel hampered when I'm speaking English. But our world is not full of people like that. Our world is full of people who live in a world of blocked translatability. Or not translatability, it's a monstrous word, but let me use the word because I'm in America and Americans are very fond of using words like this. Let's call it translationality, right? Like intersectionality. You understand what I mean. So being in this kind of translational mode. So we have to deal with a world which places everybody in a translational situation, but not equally, not symmetrically, asymmetrically. And there's some people who actually suffer this world, because living in this world is a form of suffering, where you see, if you're a rickshawala, exactly what I told you just now, that if two people want to communicate among themselves and want to cut you off completely, they would turn to English, right? So English is constantly intruding in your world, but intruding in your world not as a means of communication, but a means of incommunication. So I think this translationality should be split into two, a kind of fluent translationality and a translationality which is blocked. I might think of other words later on, but I would request you very strongly to understand whether this also works inside the academia. We pretend that in the academia we are all in the world of fluent translationality. I don't think that is true. When I hear students giving lectures, they're fluent in a certain sense, but I think it's an extremely misleading form of fluency. And I think, let me make a point which I hope it's an unpopular point. people dislike what I'm saying because that pushes them to think. I sometimes fear, even over the last month, I've been in several seminars like this, and I've sometimes listened to listened to scholars who are very young, extremely bright, but they speak in a language which I find difficult to understand. Right? Too many times, they talk about ontology when they're talking about the nature of something. Of course, everything has a nature, but you should not say it's an ontology of something, right? Unless the point is that you are thinking about the nature. What is the meaning of the term nature? It's only then you should use the term ontology. You should not use the term ontology when you want to use the term nature. It's an inflation of language. It's a misuse of language. And I feel that it's because of that, but that language has a great attraction. And I think that attraction people do not understand. It's a failed translationality which produces that attraction. And it creates a hiatus between a language of writing and a language of thinking. And the act of writing and the act of thinking, I think, get gradually separated. I would very strongly urge you to think about that. It's not that I cannot. I say sometimes to my students, I simply don't understand what you mean. Of course, I understand something about what they mean, but I want them to write more responsibly. And writing more responsibly means that they should carry their language, more responsibly, because it's a great, it's also a kind of intellectual moral responsibility that you have something which is very, very precious in your hand, and you should not use it carelessly. Let me now turn to something else. I just want you to think about this question. I might expand on this a little bit more. Let me now give you 3 examples of this translative character of our linguistic experience very quickly. When I was thinking about this, I was simply thinking of myself that whenever we think of the relation between language and the world, um, we must start from the fact that without language, the world would be closed to us. Um, a simple way, but I think a fundamentally correct way would be to say that it is through language that we access the world. We have no other way of accessing the world, right? But then I just started thinking about the linguistic way in which I can express this very simple but profound idea. And I thought, suddenly it struck me that, what I told you just now in this sentence, that it is language which opens up the world to me. Right? That's a good English way of putting it. I started thinking, because I was writing this Bengali essay, how should I put it in Bangla? And I felt that in Bangla, I would say, ভাষার মধ্যে দিয়ে জগৎটা আমার কাছে খুলে যায়. That the world opens up to me. Observe this, how the language moves. The world opens up to me through language. This is what this Bengali sentence means. ভাষার মধ্যে দিয়ে through language, জগৎটা, that is the world, আমার কাছে খুলে যায়, opens up. But when I thought about it, I felt that there's something very interesting about this, because খুলে যাওয়া in Bangla is much closer to a language which comes from a German linguistic, German tradition of thought, which is the world is disclosed to me, right? So when we discuss these things, we have a choice between 2 types of philosophical language. We can say that language opens the world up to me, right? This carries one kind of meaning. We can use a slightly more German, you will get that in Hegel, particularly if you read Gadamer's reading of Hegel, you'll see that he emphasizes that about language, very central to Heidegger, etc. That language discloses the world to us. And note the term discloses. The world is ordinarily closed. The world is closed. The world is not of itself integrally on its own open. The world is closed. And when we say that the language discloses the world to us, it discloses it cancels the closing. We take the world out of its husk, through language. So there's a kind of unwrapping that we have to do when we are dealing with anything in the world at all. That is the function of language. So if I say that I recently had an exchange meaning very friendly exchange with a very important political theorist, Jim Tully, on deparochializing political theory. And what I liked very much in his initial paper, he's a Canadian political theorist, and he's writing in an English language, which is favored by analytical philosophers. It's very limpid, very, very clear. It actually strains itself to remain clear, and not to become occluded by a kind of philosophical terminology. But what is interesting is that when he talks about this function of language, he says that language discloses the world to us, right? And I was immediately struck by this. This is an idiosyncrasy of the language, which language carries within itself. But philosophers have to note that in order to then, make it work for us philosophically. With the Germans, to Heidegger particularly, constantly makes this point about disclosure. So when I turned to Bangla, I suddenly found that Bangla actually has an affinity on this particular phrase, not in everything, but in this particular phrase, with the Germanic locution. It's actually closer to the Germanic locution rather than to the English locution. And it does a lot of work for me because I don't have to explain a lot of things simply because I'm using the term Khule there. Hans would understand this, Khule there, which is disclosure. Let me now turn to 2 points very quickly. I'm sorry for doing it in such a bitty way. If I write it, I'll try to, stitch it together into an argument. So separation, I think linguistic estrangement means that there's quite often a separation between our language of experience and language of reflection. And I would also like to think, if I write up this paper, what does this mean? Do we have to take our experience, which is done, let's say in Bangla, first through a translation into English, and then subject it to reflection, because my language of reflection is in English, in social sciences, right? So that's a question which we have to think about. Let me give you 2 examples now of the opposite kind. These are both taken from teaching that I'm doing right now. The translation position sometimes creates advantages. Some things which one language struggles to capture, or language always opens up the world by dividing the world between concepts. This is a simple structuralist point, through a differentiation of meaning of the different concepts. And each language does it differently. And let me give you 2 examples which I came across while teaching very quickly. One is the example of forgetting. I do a course on theory and method, and we often do a discussion on memory. And quite often we have a lot of discussion about memory and particularly forgetting. What is forgetting? Forgetting is failing to remember. Suddenly, I constantly read Tagore. One day I was reading a poem by Tagore, which has nothing to do with this. It's a romantic poem, partly a love poem. It says about somebody who has died and who exists for him only in a chobi, in a picture. He says, ভুলে থাকা সে তো নয় ভোলা, বিস্মৃতির মর্মে বসে অন্তরে দিয়েছে দোলা. That is, ভুলে থাকা, very hard to translate in English. Bhule thaka. Also in Hindi, I don't know enough Hindi to do that. Not bhul jana. That is forgetting. Bhule thaka is not to remember, not in the sense that I does not remember that it exists. Bhule thaka means, somebody who is very close to me, but I'm not constantly thinking of him. That is Bhule thaka. And what it says, which is astonishingly important for understanding history, is Bhule thaka, sheto noy bhola. That is not forgetting. This is not forgetting. Why? Bisritir morme boshe, that is sitting in the heart of non-remembrance, forgetting, Bisriti, অন্তরেতে দিয়েছে যে দোলা, my heart swings, because of it. It swings my heart, it constantly agitates it constantly pulsates my heart in a certain sense, sitting in the middle of forgetting. So that is what Bhule thaka is. And I found it very, very useful in discussing questions of trauma, have people forgotten partition? And I suddenly found that if I told people that, well, Bengalis have not forgotten partition. Quite often Bengalis do. What is Bhule thaka? But we have a solution to that integral sentence itself. Bhule thaka se to noy bhola. So you should not say that because I'm not talking of partition, but I have an experience of partition that I have forgotten. It is something which is quite different. And this is how I think this one example suddenly struck me, that going into something through a language, opens up possibilities which you do not have in another language. And because I have Bengali, Bengali allows me to suddenly show, through its system of differentiation in totally Saussurian sense, the sense in which, muta and mutton are different, in that kind of system of differentiation, that Bengali allows me to do something which English does not. And finally, let me finish with one point which I would discuss with my students today. I feel that in thinking about Indian nationalism very clearly, some people like Savarkar and others, they think of the Indian nation in a way which is very, very similar to the modern European nation state nationalism. And the Bengali translation of that is Jati. I can't take you through the details of the argument, but it's a simple argument. On the other hand, you have the argument of people like Gandhi, Tagore, Budhe Mukhopadhyay, etc. Bankim, one of my favorite writers, unfortunately is on the other side on this question to some extent. But
Professor Kaviraj, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt.
Yeah.
Time is running a little bit. You can take perhaps a couple more minutes, sir. We have
Yeah,
a lot of questions.
I'll finish in one
So
minute.
sorry. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think these people devise a word which they occasionally use. They say Mahajati. And there's a famous song which says, Dekhiya Bharate Mahajati Uthan, Javajono Manive Vishwa. That is, seeing the rise of Mahajati in India, the world would wonder. Now, Mahajati can mean two things. Mahajati can mean a great nation, a big muscular nation which can actually punch other nations in the face, and they should be fearing that nation. I don't think they mean that by Mahajati. They mean by Mahajati a jati which is not a jati in the European sense of the nation. It's a more complex conception of a jati, where anybody who lives in India, anybody who has been here, even for some time, who partakes of this land, is part of the jati, which is not like the jatis of Europe. So jati and Mahajati are different. But look at my difficulty when I want to do it in English. In English, Maha can only mean great, usually. I have to make an extra linguistic effort with my students to say that, look, what they're meaning by Mahajati is not a big fat nation. It's a more complex idea of a nation. So this is another advantage of being placed between different languages. So we live in a translational position always. It creates a lot of difficulties, but not difficulties always. There's some advantages as well, and we should think of both. Thank you. I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kaviraj. This was very interesting and very fascinating because since morning we have been looking at the question of vernacularity and language from the perspective of history, gendered history, and even literature and literary criticism, you have sort of opened up a new way of looking at the question of vernacularity and language. Some of the points that probably will remain with me are one, that we should not consider language as a category. Rather, we should focus on linguistic economy or language economy as a category of analysis. So that, I think, is a very important point. Secondly, you mentioned how colonialism always places us in this translational structure, but which is also asymmetrical. So asymmetricality of translational structure, both these terms, I think, are very important here. So that's another takeaway. The third point that I think is very important, that you try to elaborate through examples, but I'm sure when you write, you will write about it, and I'm looking forward to that paper, where you talk about how language opens up, or you use the word discloses, which is very important, how language discloses those worlds which remain sedimented in the structures of language, in terms of what is not forgotten. I mean, what is forgotten, but still it is there somewhere. So that is very important, and these are the approaches that we must bring when we discuss question of vernacular, or language and vernacular. So thank you very much. I now pass it on to the rapporteurs to take up questions from the chat box.
I'm sorry, I have so little time, but
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
no, we can carry on for another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
10.
Thank you, sir. We have.
I'll tell you when I have to go.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you again, Professor Kaviraj, for that engaging lecture. We have quite a lot of questions right there in the chat box, but we clearly do not have the time for all of them. So perhaps we can take up one after the other, and you can let us know when it's time to stop. So I'll start with the first question from Professor Tarun Sen, and I'm reading out the question. It's right there in the chat box. With reference to the incommunicative function of language and the dark side alluded to by Professor Kaviraj, can biculturalism, in brackets, as an extension of bilingualism at the level of being and selfhood, with hybridity as a crucial element, close parenthesis, provide a way of eluding the traps of asymmetry and exclusion, thus enabling a contestation of incommunication through dialogue? Would you like me to read it again, sir?
No.
Okay. Would you like to respond, and then we'll move to the next question? Yes.
I'll respond very quickly because we have so little time. I don't think so. I think, to say that we are bicultural and therefore we can escape these things, I think is an easy escape. And some types of modern philosophical positions are attracted to that. I think I have great respect for older traditions like Marxism, which would not allow us to get easy solutions like this. Because, I don't think the world is so asymmetric in terms of experience, communicability, and things like that. I cannot simply say that, hybridity is a term which I initially liked because it captures something which is very important about colonial history. But I've become increasingly impatient with that because I think it is a question, it's not an answer. It simply notices something which is obviously true about the colonial world. But if we notice that, we should actually try to see exactly what I said. What is the structure? Hybridity simply means that things are mixed and communicated. They interact. Of course they do. But that does not mean colonialism produces a situation where a rickshawala in the Kolkata street becomes bicultural or bilingual. As me, I become bilingual, bicultural in one way. He becomes bilingual. Would you call him bicultural? Of course, he understands the presence of the other culture. The other culture actually sits on his rickshaw, and he has to carry that culture through the city the whole day, right? But I think that's why I think that there are two parts in the question. One is that the question is very good because it actually sets up a problem, which is a very important problem for us to understand. But hybridity seems to tell us that the moment you utter the word and surround that word with some other associated word, the problem is resolved. The problem is not resolved.
Thank you, sir. I'll take up the next question as well. Right, this question is from Kashish, I believe. Yes. Thank you for saying that it is our moral responsibility to carry our vernacular language with us. But is it possible when the discussion of vernacular remain within discourses of Western critical theory, ignoring vernacular critical writing?
Of course, it's a great question, but the question answers itself. I think that is what I was asking you to think about what happens in what is happening in our education system. Of course, it cannot. And of course, in the vernacular traditions, we have great traditions of critical thinking. And not just the vernacular tradition. The vernacular tradition does not connect always very directly, but draws upon a huge Sanskrit tradition for a very long time. There's also a Persian tradition, which is not equally accessible to me. But being placed in my department, I'm surrounded by some of the great scholars of Persian and Arabic, right? And that must also flow through the Islamic side of our culture. I don't want to go into that very much because I don't know very much about it. But the thing is that I think when you do literary criticism in India, you should do vernacular criticism in the sense that look into Tagore and bring out the concepts which work in Tagore, because some of the concepts actually come through the Vaishnava theologians, from Abhinavagupta, etc., etc. Right. So learn to see those things. I'm not saying that you should give up on what you get from Western theory. My own language is totally constituted by Western theory in a certain sense. But I'm deeply troubled by this, that the total colonization of our intellectual world by something which is Western, by becoming post-colonial, it has actually become much more acceptable to us. And it raises questions of a different kind. Let me tell you something which is probably, it should be part of your discussion. I'm writing a paper for a conference that some of my students are organizing on decolonizing political theory. And I start by saying, imagine a paradise, epistemic paradise, in which everybody in every part of the world speaks in a language, which is the language of the Ivy League, of Columbia University, right? Everybody, everywhere, speaks in that language. Is it a decolonized world, or is it a colonized world? Or is it just a world which has gone through a kind of cultural McDonaldization? In the sense that, all other cultures are eliminated in a certain sense. So I think this question goes into that. I think it's a great question. And the other problem is that people must understand what it means to carry the vernacular. There's a sense in which we carry the vernacular because it's experiential, but carrying the vernacular is not so easy. You have to learn the vernacular. And you have to be good at the vernacular to say that I carry it. That's another problem. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So we have a couple more other questions. Shall I club it all together for you and ask you, sir? Or
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
yes, and you can answer as you please.
I wish I could be part of your conference, because I looked at the list of the papers, and it would have been very enriching experience for me. But unfortunately, we cannot do that. Yeah, carry on.
Thank you, sir. So I'll just read one after the other. The next question is, could you elaborate on the process of translationality with respect to world making? That's question number one. Question number two is this. Thank you, Professor Kaviraj, for that insightful lecture. While talking about the communicability and incommunicability of language, you commented on the use or misuse of certain words in academia. I was in fact thinking of quite the opposite, where we often see a conscious and complex use of language by theorists, through which they challenge the seeming ideological innocence of language. I would appreciate if you could share your thoughts on this. The next question is from Vikramaditya Sahe. I would like greater clarity around two things. I would argue internal to fluency that might suggest that the two modes of the fluent and the blocked, perhaps broken, are less successful than suggested. One, the unconscious, which interrupts the awareness of fluency. Two, opacity, as theorized by Glissa. We have one more question, which I'll just read out. This is from Nandini Kalita. One of the functions of art is estrangement. Literary language draws attention to itself. Do you think being at home and yet not being at home in a language has any implication on the question of literary creation? That will be all for the time being.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. Really wonderful questions. If I had an hour, I could have gone on answering them. Let me make 2 points very quickly. It's not that, when I say that I'm thinking about something, I necessarily have an answer to that. There are some things which come to your view and you start thinking about it. It takes time to hold it in your attention and to think through it. We should not pretend, which I think is an academic disease, that whenever somebody asks you a question, you have an answer for it. I think if somebody does that, I immediately suspect, that kind of thing. I'm not comfortable with it. I think we must actually learn to say that I do not understand. I do not understand in a deeper sense, or I haven't thought about it. So there are some things, for instance, the question about the unconscious. I think it's a deep question, difficult question for me, because I'm not very much into psychoanalysis. But I think it's an important question. And the whole point of having an academic discussion of this kind is precisely that thinking is done collectively. So somebody raises something which actually is dropped into the minds of 15 people, and 2 people actually find a good way of thinking through it, while the person who actually raised it and dropped it in people's mind might not. So I think that's why I find the questions very good. So let me, because there's so many, I've forgotten now. Could you remind me about the questions again from the last one?
Yes, done. Certainly, certainly. So I'll quickly go over it. Yes, one is, could you elaborate on the process of translationality with respect to word making?
Let me make one point, the very last point about literary language and estrangement. Estrangement, notice one thing, that estrangement is not anything that we do to separate something from ourselves, to look at it closely. Of course, literary language is like that. And that's why literary language is not estrangement. Somebody who arranges that with himself or herself, right, is not falling into estrangement. Estrangement is something else. That's why I think Marx uses the term estrangement very defining it very closely. That there's certain cases which should be called estrangement. Not all cases of this kind are estrangement. So literary language which does that is not estrangement. I'm not opposed to the idea of using difficult concepts. Concepts are difficult always, in the sense that the true function of a concept is to go over something which is complex and knotty, and to give us certain intellectual clarity about it. So, of course, because the problem is difficult, particularly the initial concepts through which philosophers try to unknot them, they are actually difficult concepts. A lot of the concepts in Hegel, I think, are difficult because of that, because he's opening up a field, which is a new field in a certain sense, historicity. What is history? It's a new field. Derrida, in some cases, but Derrida is also sometimes astonishingly clear when he says that I have only one language, and even that is not my own. It's not difficult to understand. It's something which is profound. It's something which is very clear. But when you get into something which is really new, for which you do not have a prepared language waiting for you, then your language initially would be difficult. And I welcome that kind of difficulty. But the difficulty should not remain forever. No, the difficulty is something which should, a difficult concept must be a step, in the intellectual resolution of some difficulty. What I'm critical of is a tendency to use a language, in a way where it's actually not doing any function of serious thinking or new thinking. That is what I've become impatient of, in a sense, because I work in an environment where students are constantly trying to do it. And I have to find a way in which I have to encourage them to think well and to think complexly. But at the same time, I have to warn them to say that, look, you are not doing any thinking. You are simply doing, it's a totally quotational practice. All that I can see from what you are saying is that you are familiar with some part of Derrida and you are familiar with some part of Heidegger, but that's not your own thinking, right? I do not mind at all, people using that. But I think we must understand that there's an attendant danger of this kind, apart from the fact that, it puts people off. I'm not very worried about putting people off so much. But the world-making question, I'm not very certain, because, the world-making question might come from the fact that what I use in my thinking is very eclectic. I'm deeply influenced by some forms of German and French thought, which is quite clear, obvious. But I'm also very influenced by analytical philosophy, because analytical philosophy is intolerant of obscurity. And the demand that, if it is something which is serious thinking, you should be able to communicate it in a language which people understand. You might have to struggle with the language. Language is always a struggle in a certain sense. Something which comes out beautifully at the end, even Phule Thakar Shito Noy Bhola, it's beautiful. It's beautiful because of its simplicity and profundity. But I suspect that it hides the struggle, right? And so language thinking is always a struggle. So that I do not mind at all. I haven't dealt with all the questions, but thanks very much for the questions. I think the questions are really very good.
Okay, sir. Nishat, would you like to conclude?
No, thank you. I pass it on to Hans for concluding remarks. Thank you, Professor Kaviraj, for this very fascinating conversation that we have had. Apart from the talk that you gave, the question answer session was equally, in fact, very interesting. So thank you so much. I would request Hans to give his concluding remarks.
Thank you.
Audible?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So nothing much left for me to say. I would also like to thank you very much, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, and we should have had more time. Would have liked to go on for another hour or so, but then we've had a long day and you have a long day ahead of you. So have a good day, everybody. Have a good day, have a good evening, and we're meeting again tomorrow very early in the morning by German standards and moderately early by Indian standards, right?
Yes, and before
So
leave, Professor Kaviraj will be looking forward to your paper. Thank you.
Very
much.
Yes.
Thank
okay.
you.
On behalf of the conference team, thank you, Professor Kaviraj, once again. Thank you, Professor Hans Harder. Thank you so much, Professor Nishat Zaidi. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks to the entire team, to the rapporteurs, and please announce the time for tomorrow.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Professor Zaidi. So thank you everyone for staying till late with all of us. As day one comes to an end, I would like to invite all of you to our upcoming sessions tomorrow. We start at 9 a.m. IST and we have a brilliant lineup throughout the day, including plenary sessions by Dr. Anjali Narlekar, Dr. Baidik Bhattacharya, Dr. Margaret Parnau, Dr. Arian Hopf, Professor Ruth Vanita, Dr. Preetha Mani, Dr. Snehal Shinghavi. Please log in tomorrow on time. See you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.